things, particularly about the Middle East, about Russia, about the Ukraine, those sorts of things? Well, I do. I do. You say, well, you're teaching it a lot. So, well, I've always watched these things. I have a massive file of things like what I've pulled out. These are just some things in the last week. Here's an article entitled, How Many Americans Think We're in the Last Days of the Bible? How many people think we're in the last days? Well, the fact is we are in the last days, and we've been in the last days since Jesus ascended to the Father, but that's the technical answer. The question is really how many people believe that right now things are converging on us in a way that represents what the Bible refers to as the latter times or the latter days. And so the Joshua Fund, which is led by a man named Joel Rosenberg. I don't know if you're familiar with Rosenberg. He is a Messianic Jew. He got saved many years ago, has worked for numerous government officials, both in the U.S. and was an aide to Netanyahu many years ago. He's a brilliant guy. He's a brilliant writer. He's written a number of novels. Have you read any of his novels? Have any of you read any of his novels? You know, he's eerily accurate in some of his writings. But he also has an organization called the Joshua Fund, and they did a survey. They asked several questions. In the survey, the first question they asked was, do you agree or disagree that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has ignited the biggest land war in Europe since World War II, do you agree or disagree, is one of the signs that Jesus spoke of in the Bible when he warned that there would be wars and rumors of wars in the last days before his return? In other words, he's saying, do you think this particular thing is getting real specific? And so he asked that the survey asked that question of the people that took that, and it was not Christians. It was just the poll was to whoever. So I'm sure some of them were. How would you answer that? Do I need to repeat the question? That worries me with sermons coming up. Do you agree or disagree that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is one of the signs that Jesus spoke of in the Bible when he warned that there will be wars and rumors of wars in the last days before his return? Agreed? You agree or disagree? You disagree. You don't believe that this has anything to do with that. It's okay. Yeah, you're on the right trail, Robert. But you didn't come to my first sessions on this, okay? But there are people that don't believe this. I do believe it is prophetic. I don't believe there are some people I respect who believe this is actually the beginning of the Magog invasion. All right. There's some. I think it's the precursor. I think it, again, is part of Russia's effort to move south, as we talked about. And eventually, with the coalition of mostly Muslim countries, began to move at Israel. And I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, so how many of you agree that this is prophetic? What's going on is prophetic in that sense? Okay. And others say, I don't, maybe I'm just not sure. Yeah, okay, all right. Time will tell, won't it? Time will answer. But here's the response, and the writer of the article says, I was stunned by how many Americans said yes. They believe this is a prophetic sign. Not necessarily Christians, just Americans. Nearly 4 in 10 Americans, that's roughly 40%, it's 39.8%, said that they agree that the invasion is a sign of biblical prophecy coming to pass and of the last days. And nearly the same number, 40.3%, said they disagree. and 19.9% are Baptists because they said, I don't know. All right. So just interesting that you've got about 40% of the people that have no necessary confession that they are Christians who said, yeah, they believe that it is possible. Now, we've been talking about Israel, and, in the first couple of weeks, I set up a scenario for you that could trigger some things that could further trigger or give Russia a reason to continue to drop down. And this Monday morning, in my copy of the Wall Street Journal, Israel steps up campaign against Iran. And I just highlighted a few things. Israeli leaders refer to the campaign. Listen to this. This is the second time in a week I've heard this expressed. One by a prophecy teacher who said what a lot of people, a lot of Christians don't know is that there is what he called a shadow war going on right now between Israel and Iran. He said there are mysterious explosions. We always hear about, there was something went off in Iran. And he said, what we know is that those are not as mysterious as we're led to believe. Those are from Israel. And at the same time, Iran is backing Hezbollah and getting weapons. And so when you hear about these weapons that are being fired into Israel and from the Palestinians, they're being supplied by the Iranians. All right? And so the Israeli leaders refer to the campaign as, this is what they call it, the war between the wars. In other words, this is a war going on that they don't want a lot of attention drawn to, but it's kind of a shadow war, as one guy said. And there's a war going on, but they call it the war between the wars. That there's this war going on, and we're in between an eventual war that's coming. The war between the wars. So there, right here, there's a war going on right now. There's another one. What they're saying is, we know there's another war coming. Just interesting, isn't it? And it says, among targets hit by Israel's Russian-supplied air defense systems. By the way, that's interesting in itself, isn't it? Russian-supplied air defense systems, drone bases operated by Iranian military advisors, and precision-guided missile systems that are being transported to Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon. And so, by the way, it says that Israel has stayed in touch with Russia. I won't read all this to you, but has stayed in touch with Russia, letting Russia know when they're going to fire missiles into Syria. And they have an agreement with Russia that Russia do nothing in response to their own retaliation to Hezbollah in Syria that bombs them. And right now, they have this agreement, which is one of the reasons, the article says, is that Israel has not come out and taken a position related to the Ukrainian invasion. Am I making sense? So Russia and Israel, before Israel will launch a series of missiles into Syria, and here's the reason why, because Russia controls Syria. They control Syria. And so when Israel attacks, they let Russia know, we're about to bomb this site and this site and this site, which may be near Russian military bases, but so they are letting them know in advance, so Russia knows what they're essentially attacking, which from a military standpoint doesn't make sense to me, but it's the war between the wars. So, but Israel, I just think that's an interesting statement that Israel's military leader calls it the war between the wars. There's a war going on right now. There's us. We're the war that nobody really recognizes in this kind of stuff that's going on. And then there's a war coming. So they're all agreed about that. By the way, I just did some research and reading about something that's about to happen next month that you've heard of, the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab, the Great Reset, you've been hearing about, very dangerous stuff. Davos and the World Economic. Have y'all heard of Davos before, this gathering of the elite financiers and moguls and all this? Meets every year has been doing it. The first time in 2 years because of COVID that they're reconvening physically. Davos, Switzerland. It's a resort area, and they'll have a couple of thousand, by invitation only, movers and shakers, politicians from around the world. They're going to gather in May. This will be their annual meeting, and you can look them up, and you can go see the agenda that they're going to talk about. Part of that, in one of the articles I was reading, is about how to do essentially a reset, an economic reset for the world. And trying to establish maybe even, here's what I predict eventually is going to happen. All this stuff you've been hearing about cryptocurrency and all of that, which I have to be honest, I don't understand the cryptocurrency. It is confidence is all it is on something. It's a digital currency that you can't physically put your hands on. It's just a confidence thing. And here's where we're headed with that. That will eventually, I think, be the attempted world currency. And by that, they can, plenty of articles out there talk about that. By that, they'll be able to monitor every single transaction because guess what happens? No more cash. See, cash can't always be tracked. But if there's this global currency that's digital, then they can track every single transaction. Guys, do you get it? We're moving to a place where the Bible says that unless you receive a certain mark, you won't even be able to buy or sell. Cryptocurrency may not be that mark. I don't believe it is, but I believe it's one more step closer to getting us to a place where you really don't make transactions physically much anymore. So, guys, this stuff, this was an interesting article. It says, while you were distracted, international elite meet to plan world government. And the article talked about the fact that it says, everybody's been paying attention to Will Smith and his punching that comedian kind of thing. And that's been in all the news. And it's sarcasm in the articles. Like, you're watching Will Smith, and that's what everybody's consumed by, and everybody's missing the real stuff that's going on. And that is certainly some of the concerns that we have. World Economic Forum calls for digital one world currency. This is all in the last week. And then there's an interesting article about hostility and to the Christian faith. And this particular article talks about how the new mayor of New York City was appointing an education committee, an overarching committee for the whole New York educational system. And he appointed to the committee, when he announced the committee, it included a lady who has a deep background in education and highly decorated in that world. But she happens to be a Christian. And she had made a statement in some writing years before about the fact that essentially she said transgenderism is not natural. Well, the LGBTQTRS, V, W, Y, and Z, they keep adding letters, but said they started looking into everybody that was appointed. When they came to her, they went ballistic and put so much pressure on the mayor that before she could even be sworn in, he pulled her out. Because they said she will be against us educating the children into the the acceptability of transgenderism and these sorts of things. And so the article is about that. People, do y'all believe persecution is coming? See, persecution is coming. The Bible's very clear about that. Just Americans just have a hard time. American church has a hard time believing that we're going to have to suffer. We think we're special in the kingdom. And we're not. We're not special. I think there was a time where God's favor rested on us because we were taking the gospel to the world, but those days have long passed. And what's coming, the church in America is not prepared for. And it's going to probably happen in our lifetime. The pace is quickening, isn't it? Guys, that's 1 week worth of material that I pulled out. And that's not all of it. It's just what I decided to come and just say. It's happening before your eyes. Keep your antenna up. Now, all right, let's jump in and knock out a few more things here. In Acts chapter 17, you remember verse 26, we talked about Paul was at the Areopagus. I told you about that, where that Mars Hill is sometimes referred to. It's right below the Parthenon, which is on the top of the hill there. And he's talking to these philosophers. They have all these gods. These are religious philosophers. They have all these gods. They have an idol to the unknown God. He said, I want to tell you who that God is. And he explains that he's actually God, the creator of all things. And then in verse 26, he makes this statement. And he, that is God, made from one man every nation. You remember I told you, if you ever wonder about a literal creation, Paul believed it. Paul believed in Adam. And he said that God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods. I told you that means historical duration, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. And he did that, by the way, the purpose is that they should seek God. And so God had purpose even in creating the nations. And one of those purposes was that all nations would seek God. All nations would seek God. That was his intended purpose. And I told you last week, I talked to you about a nation's God-created existence. We exist because God created us. And anytime God says, either I'm done or I've had enough, it's over. It's curtains. I've told you for years that I believe that God did favor America. I wouldn't say God is favoring America at all right now. And that ought to scare us to death. But he has allowed us to continue to exist. That's a subject for another day. But I would say this, part of that is because America has been Israel's only friend. But we're even pulling back from that, and have been in a couple of our presidential administrations. They pulled back. So God has created us. We have this God-created existence. The second thing I would say to you is we ought to remember a nation's God-allowed expansion. And he says that not only has God created us, but God's given us boundaries. Historical duration, that's the boundaries that he has put upon us. So having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. The boundaries, the timelines, the physical boundaries of a nation. Simply put, a nation will never become larger than God allows it. He has specific boundaries from which a nation is to exist and thus serve him. Paul proclaimed that it is God who is the creator of the world and the human race, and he is the Lord of history and of human race. People may not recognize that, but he is the Lord of history and the Lord of the human race. Job put it this way in Job chapter 12, verse 23, God makes nations great. He destroys them. He enlarges nations, and he leads them away. Do you get that? This is what Job is saying. God creates them, he makes them great, and he destroys them. He enlarges nations, and he leads them away. Here's some practical application for us when we think that. The fact is, what Job is saying and what Paul is saying is simply this: God's in control. And not in some esoteric kind of mystical way. God is actively in control of the details. if I didn't understand Scripture and eschatology on some level, and I read the Bible in relation to what I'm watching, I think it'd scare me to death. Because you say, you can't make this up. It's not like, what a coincidence that all of these things keep matching up with Scripture. Why? Because God is in control. He is actively in control of the details. It's also a reminder that He's in control of your boundaries as well. Just as He's in control of the boundaries of nations and humanity, He's personally in control of your boundaries. One of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 16. But in Psalm 16:16, the psalmist writes and says, the boundary lines, David says, the boundary lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Isn't that a great line? You know what he's saying? When I look at my life, the boundaries that God has put in my life, they've fallen in pleasant places. I didn't create them. God created them. They've fallen in pleasant places. When I look at those two grandsons, I think about that verse, God, the boundary lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Thank you for the boundaries that you have formed in my life. That's a national truth, but it is a personal truth too. God is in control of nations and nations' destinies. And we need to make sure we don't forget that. And God is moving the nations to this kind of ultimate climax that will culminate with eventually us going to be with Him. All right, so we saw nations, God allowed existence. So nations, God allowed expansion. And then third, a nation's God-controlled endurance. Again, I refer you back to the statement he makes, having determined allotted periods. God determines the lifespans of nations. He controls how long they endure. Now, that makes sense, doesn't it? If He created them and if He formed the boundaries, then He controls the timeline of their existence. And just as He has created the boundaries of your life, He also controls the timeline of your existence. Now, how do we know that? Because the Scripture says all the days of your life were written in God's book before there was even one of them. Before they were all there. And by the way, that's not, you could abuse that verse and say, well, I don't need to take care of myself, or I don't need, because of all the, it didn't say you couldn't be stupid and interrupt the plan, God. But all the days are written down and of our life. We've done too many funerals here lately. I was doing a funeral recently, and one of the family members came up and said to me, but Pastor, I've heard you say, all the days of our life are written down in His book before we ever had one. So this came as no surprise to God. I said, that's right. That's right. We hurt, but it's not like God was shocked, because the days are there. So that's our God controlled endurance. He determines the lifespan of nations. He controls how long they endure. It's been asked, where are the great empires of the past? Where are the great empires of the past? Where's the Assyrian Empire? Where's the Babylonian Empire? Where's the Roman Empire? Where's the Greek Empire? And all of that sort of, where are they? Well, we consider these to be the greatest empires in history. Daniel talked about the great, there was the Babylonian Empire. They were conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persians were conquered by the Grecian Empire. And then Rome conquered the Grecian Empire. And then there was what we call the divided kingdom, or the eventual divided kingdom. All of the great empires of the past are just that. They are world history. Where can you find them today? You can only find them in what's left of them, the remnants of them that is in museums, in ruins, maybe in a few ancient stone buildings. You can still visit some of those in modern tours, But the empires themselves don't exist anymore, do they? The Babylonian Empire. It ruled the Middle East with armies that were unstoppable in its day. And the Babylonian Empire was destroyed and brought down in one night. It ruled the world. These are the great empires. Where are they? One night, the Babylonian Empire was brought down. How about the Persian Empire? It conquered Babylon and became the largest empire on the earth. It lasted 200 years. Conquered the Babylonian Empire one night. It lasted 200 years. Remember I told you the average length of world empires is 200 years. And it lasted 200 years. It ruled the world in its day, but it eventually fell. Guess who conquered it? Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. The Roman Empire expanded like no empire ever had. It lasted for 500 years, but it eventually collapsed from within due to corruption in the Roman government and moral decadence. Now, if you want to see America, go read about the Roman Empire. Edward Gibbons, who is a secular writer, 3 volumes considered the classic. They've got an abridged version, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. But if you want to get from a theological perspective, read Francis Schaeffer, How Then Shall We Live? Because he parallels, and he did this back in the 70s, and showed the parallels of America, what was coming. It's like he had looked 30, 40 years into the future. But he shows how America and Rome are at exactly the same places, except Rome was just about 300 years older than America. The Third Reich, you know that, spread across Europe, North Africa like a fire, killed 6 million Jews, really probably closer to 10 million people. And it was proclaimed by Hitler to be the 1,000-year Reich. He said this empire will last for 1,000 years. And it really was pretty dominant in Europe. It lasted 12 years. The Soviet Union, at its height, became the largest country in the world by landmass. And according to an article in Foreign Affairs, we now know that the Soviet Union actually had nuclear superiority over the United States. But as an empire, after years of being a world superpower, it collapsed in 5 years. And we all remember that, right? Part of what's going on right now is Putin is trying to restore what most of us, I won't say all of us, but what most of us grew up as calling the Soviet Empire. And he was a part of the KGB in leadership during the Soviet era and wants to restore all of that. It's common knowledge, and he's made that clear. But the Soviet Empire collapsed within 5 years. In his book, The End of Christendom, Malcolm Muggeridge makes a powerful observation. I love Malcolm Muggeridge. Was an atheist, was editor of Punch magazine in Britain for many years, an atheist. He got saved, and man, when he got saved, read Malcolm Muggeridge's stuff. There's a lot. He's dead, but his books are fantastic. He got saved. You know what caused him to give his life to Christ? He went to Calcutta, India, to do a story on Mother Teresa. And he watched Mother Teresa. Now, Mother Teresa was a Catholic, but Malcolm Muggeridge became a born-again Christian. And his books are just fantastic. Listen to what he says. He says, I conclude that civilizations, like every other human creation, wax and wane. By the nature of the case, there can never be a lasting civilization any more than there can be a lasting spring or lasting happiness in an individual life or a lasting stability in a society. It is in the nature of man and of all that he constructs to perish, and it must ever be so. The world is full of the debris of past civilization, and others are known to have existed which have not left any debris behind them, but just simply disappeared. Do you get what he was saying? There is no such thing in this world as an empire that lives forever. The decline and fall of nations are usually due to internal factors rather than external threats. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you? You see a nation collapse on the inside before it crumbles from the outside. It becomes vulnerable. Roman Empire, they became very lazy. They were decadent. They were morally perverse. I mean, big time, morally perverse. Rome, at its pinnacle, they had an army that nobody could stand against. They were so highly trained, these Roman centurions. In fact, you know, there were two Roman centurions at the tomb of Christ because they were so skilled in their craft. A Roman soldier could protect 16 feet of square ground around them. So they put two to keep anybody from getting in and to keep anybody from getting out. They got half of it right. And they were that skilled at the height of the Roman Empire. But you know what began to happen? They had these skirmishes on their borders with other nations, in particular the barbarians. And that's, you know, barbarian, you don't want to be called a barbarian because it's a ruffian, it's a mental midget, it's a guy that doesn't have a clue kind of thing, right? The barbarians overran Rome. They took over. And here's what happened. Rome became wealthy. Hello, America. Rome became wealthy, and they started changing their army up. Hello, America. And what they started doing is they started, Robert says, well, I've got enough money, and I'll pump enough money back into the system. I'll pay for somebody to go serve in my place. And so you had immigrants. I'm not against immigration. I'm for controlled immigration that is lawful immigration. But Rome's board, just like America, people were trying to get in because it was thriving, work and all this. And so what the Roman soldiers, when they got a little bit prosperous, would do is they would say they had these people that were working the common man. And so they get him, say, he's from some other country, say, hey, how would you like to make a bunch of money? Go serve my place in the army. And because there was a lot of money, and if you had enough money, you could pay somebody to serve. Now, guess what happens when you got an army full of people? They're only there to draw a paycheck, and suddenly they get in a war with people that don't care about anything but killing you. I mean, they fight with clubs, among other things, sure. And they don't care. So you're out there and you're saying, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for this. I don't mind guarding a building over there, but I didn't sign up for this. I got conscripted into a war. And so what did they do? When those kind of battles happened, they just laid their weapons down. They ran. They hightailed it. Make sense? So guess what? So the outsider barbarians gained more and more. They won more battles. They gained more influence. They took over things. And because Rome became soft, they collapsed. Well, just a little about that. We're going to stop there. Next week, I want to talk to you about two things that affect a nation's ability to endure. Is there hope? I'm almost finished. Y'all come back. And then we'll decide where we're going from there. Do you have any questions about anything we've talked about tonight? Yeah, good question. Robert asked, do I think the rise of a neo-Soviet, a new Soviet empire would also bolster the rise of a new Roman Empire? Because there are prophecy teachers who tell us that Rome will be the capital of the New World Order and that sort of stuff. I don't think there's much to substantiate that. I don't think so, Robert. That's just an opinion, though. So take it for what it's worth. Uh, but I tell you, and I'll close with this, I think what we've got to watch is not Rome, not Italy. I think what we've got to watch, there are all kind of triggers. And who knows? Mine is speculation. I think it's somewhat educated speculation. I've done a lot of study with some other folks who generally agree. We've got to watch right now. We've got to continue to watch. What does Russia do? Okay? Because they could trigger some stuff, and Putin is getting humiliated. That's good and bad. Because desperation might cause him to launch an attack that could, create war in Europe all over. NATO. Did y'all notice that Putin said today that any NATO military vehicles that are in, I guess, the Ukraine area, they will treat them as enemy targets. Now, will he? I don't know, but you get desperate. A man gets desperate, and he's not thinking right. We know that. So you got to watch Russia, what they're doing, how they're continuing to try to drop down. Where will they stop if they stop? And here's a piece to that. You just heard about the shadow war. So, and I've told you that for years, that Israel is not going to let Iran get nuclear weapons, okay? So if Israel continues to strike like they're doing, that could eventually move from this little, we'll shoot designated missiles at designated targets, and missiles may start flying of a different sort. Not necessarily nuclear, but possibly. We know Iran is working desperately to acquire nuclear weapons. So that could trigger, that changes the Soviet, that changes the Russian response most likely, and gives them provocation to move toward Israel. But here's something that we're not talking a lot about. Not only should we be watching Russia, we need to be watching China and Taiwan. Because if Taiwan, which they've threatened to do, declares their independence, China has already said, we will invade. China is watching to see how the world responds to Russia right now. Now, here's where I'm going with this. Y'all just hang on just a second. So if China, let's say China declared a war against Taiwan while Russia has declared war in the Ukraine, and by the way, they've become buddies in the last year, Russia and China, and I believe it is so both of them can advance their agenda without having to deal with the other one, because they've been enemies. And so Russia is battling Ukraine. Let's say Taiwan declares independence. China says, nope, we told you, we're coming in. It is going to be hard for America to stay neutral on that one because of the technology and all the chips and all. My wife's car needed servicing today. I dropped it off at the dealership for them to service it. And I told the guy, he was shuttling me back to the church, I said, y'all don't have any cars on the lot. He said, yeah, and anything we get goes right back out. He said, we sell it that fast. When I picked up the vehicle today and I looked at the bill, I said, well, I know where you're making your money up. You don't have enough cars to sell, so you're getting us in the service department, Well, here's that's the auto industry is dependent on chips. You know where almost all of those chips are made? Taiwan. Not just automobile chips, but primarily the largest part of those chips are made in Taiwan and other things. So an economy, a culture that is now built on technology like we are, the whole world in some respects, cannot make it without chips. So some of the analysts say America couldn't be neutral on that one. They would have to go in. Then here's a scary spot. There are some prophecy teachers who believe that if America engaged China, that Russia would attack America because you can't fight on two fronts. And that Russia would launch an unexpected attack on America. That's a chilling thought, isn't it? I've told you before, we don't see, I think there's one place where we see the possibility of America, but you can see how America suddenly could be irrelevant to what's going on in the globe. That's a good note to close on. Hey, keep looking up. Your redemption draws near. Man, if you don't have that to hang on to, you'll live in fear. You know, what's coming for us eventually is better than what's coming for us. Right? Amen? Anybody here not sure if you died, you go to heaven, tonight would be a good night to put your trust in Jesus Christ. We win. Okay, we win. Anybody? I need to do that. Anybody here say, I have done that. I need a church home and I want to join Ridgecrest. Anybody? Okay. What's that? Oh, I'm sorry. That was private conversation. Excuse me. All right.